This week on Just Solutions, we look at social inequalities that are exacerbated by the climate crisis. Ongoing events like extreme heat and floods resulting from climate change are disproportionately impacting poor communities and communities of colour. And with temperatures continuing to rise, these disparities will increase. So, how can urban planners mitigate these inequalities, and what can be done to help already marginalised communities in the face of the climate crisis? Our guest today is Vivek Shandas, a professor of geography at Portland State University. He's co-authored a study that shows a direct connection between racist urban housing policies and extreme heat. From Free Speech TV, Just Solutions. Vivek, it's great to have you with us. Thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you, Maeve. It's great to be here.
Well, we're going to talk about what's happening globally in just a minute. Of course, the devastating floods in Pakistan have left, little doubt that the climate crisis is definitely, the brunt of it is being borne by communities that have the least resources to deal with it. In fact, this term climate apartheid has now been coined. But I want to bring it back to what's happening here in the US, because many people may not be aware of the disproportionate impact on certain communities here in the US. And go back to that study that you co-authored that showed a very direct link between racist housing policies, redlining, and the disproportionate heat that is being suffered in those communities. I know you looked at about 100 cities or so, and you found some very concrete evidence. So tell us exactly what you were looking at and what you discovered.
Sure. So our study was based on the premise that empirical evidence over decades have shown us that heat kills more people than any other natural hazard in the United States nationally. And that really kind of underpins a number of social and political factors that go back decades. And we spent a long time trying to understand, why are we seeing a greater amount of poverty? Why are we seeing a greater number of communities of color in places that were the hottest part of an urban region or a city? And we were finding differences of temperature upwards of 5, 10, 15, sometimes even 20 degrees Fahrenheit difference between one part of a city or one neighborhood and another neighborhood. And for a very long time, almost a decade, I was scratching my head wondering why that was. So this study was really born out of a question of this disparity that we're seeing in the exposure to extreme heat is so systematic and so consistent across the country. We wanted to ask the question, why was that a pattern we were observing in our research? So we dug in a little bit deeper, and we went into a question of redlining, which was a very convenient data set that had been published by the University of Richmond, where they had taken over 150 maps that had these 4 distinct colors on them, where the term redlining comes from. One is the color blue, and the other is the color green, both of which are areas that were supported with federally backed mortgage insurance. So mortgages, so someone defaulted on their loans in those neighborhoods, and they could get backed by the federal government to not go into default with those loans. And so that was a period of 1930s all the way up until 1968. These particular neighborhoods that were green and blue were given mortgage insurance. And then these other neighborhoods, which were yellow and red, outlined in those 2 colors, actually didn't have any of those kinds of insurance policies. So we asked the question, maybe the fact that we had this intense codified process of policies that would segregate neighborhoods, maybe that would help us better understand why we're seeing certain areas greatly disinvested, and as a result seeing greater temperature increases in those neighborhoods, and other areas with a lot of investment, literally and figuratively a lot of investment going into those green and blue neighborhoods. And maybe that would help us distinguish why we were seeing these patterns. So as we dug into these digitized redlining maps that the University of Richmond provided, and we downloaded a lot of satellite image of temperature of surfaces in each of these neighborhoods, we were finding that in the red line neighborhoods, temperatures were on average about 5 degrees Celsius warmer than their non-red line counterparts. And so that really tells us that there's a really large disparity in cities based on whether you lived in an area that was historically segregated and colored red by these housing developers and planners and consultants, or whether you lived in a blue or green neighborhood. And so that disparity was really pronounced because we found it across 108 cities in the United States where redlining was operating. And not only that, we were able to even rank these cities in terms of the proportion of difference between those redlined and green-lined counterparts. And that was really ranking out where the city that I'm based in, Portland, turned out to be the top of that list. Totally surprised me in many respects because I had heard about redlining occurring in Chicago and Baltimore and Miami, and I'd heard of all these stories and narratives put together. Though Portland was number one on that list, then came Denver and Minneapolis, and then essentially 94% of the cities that we looked at consistently had this pattern where the red line were hotter than the green lined areas of the city. So in a nutshell, that was an empirical, like an actual evidence-based study that was able to link a federal housing policy from the 1930s, and that was abolished in 1968 during the Fair Housing Act. And yet we see that long shadow of its impact as temperatures are continuing to rise across the planet, and neighborhoods are at the kind of epicenter of the experience of those acute temperatures that people are exposed to.
Well, we're going to dig into what exactly is happening in those communities nowadays that is causing this heat to be even more extreme. As you mentioned, there could be up to 5 degrees with rising temperatures. That is very, very significant. But we have discussed a lot on Just Solutions, how systemic racism has infiltrated every aspect of society, and particularly when it comes to issues like housing, and how housing then is connected very much to intergenerational wealth or indeed poverty. And because entire communities and entire demographics were excluded from accessing housing, being able to buy these insured mortgages, their entire families and generations then have been excluded from accumulating wealth through housing and have been then essentially segregated for multi-generations into these areas. So if we bring that up to 2022, what are the characteristics of these neighborhoods and these cities that you looked at that are common across all of those neighborhoods that had been redlined that is leading to this extreme heat?
Sure. Yeah, it's the next question in the work, and we're right now actually about to put out a couple of additional follow-on papers that gets at this question. So let me give you the punchline ahead of those papers being published, is simply that when a neighborhood over a course of 30, 40, 50, 100 years gets disinvested in over time, meaning there is less money going into housing, there's communities that are experiencing intergenerational poverty decade after decade, what we start seeing is that when large projects like highway projects of the 1950s or housing projects of the same era, public housing projects or big box stores of the 70s and 80s, when these land-hungry developments are being sited in a city, they go to areas that are the least land rent values. So from an urban economics point of view, it would make a lot of sense to put large developments like industrial or manufacturing into areas that cost less. The land actually costs less. And when you disinvest in an area over decades, that land by design is lower rent values. And those developments then end up going into these neighborhoods, often adjacent to existing communities, or sometimes even right on top of existing communities. And we end up seeing asphalt, concrete, and the amount of these very dense materials that absorb the sun's radiation, hold on to it, and amplify over time, re-radiating out and creating higher temperatures in these neighborhoods. So you think about a freeway project from the 1950s that basically divided a neighborhood and created this enormous amount of asphalt and concrete that then absorb that sun's radiation and pushes it into these adjacent neighborhoods. So when these disinvested neighborhoods were getting divided through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and on, with freeways, we started seeing a very clear signal from temperatures, about actually experience and exposure of higher temperatures increasing in these neighborhoods. So that was really a pattern that pretty much prevailed all the way through the 1950s, and we're seeing it even today, where we're seeing, whether where a Walmart ends up, or where one of these large kind of commercial developments end up. They often go to areas that have historically been disinvested and have been essentially forgotten by a lot of municipal planners and other decision makers. And so communities are left kind of really in many ways isolated in these pockets of what we call urban heat islands, where these temperatures are, we've actually been able to measure in some cases upwards of 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and in some cases 25 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than their non-redlined counterparts in the same city at the same time.
It seems as well that these neighborhoods are marked by what are notable by what's missing as well. I mean, we often see euphemisms around wealthy areas like leafy suburbs. When you read that, well, that also indicates that there's wealth. So if there are tree canopy, that as a more affluent area, it seems almost a given these days. And we know that in a lot of these urban areas, there's a lack of tree canopy. And I know that is very much related to heat, but also acoustics as well, that often having a tree canopy, it adds not just to the physical beauty of a space, but there's so many other knock-on effects. It helps with shade, of course, but also with the acoustics. And so talk a little bit about that maybe the absence of things like tree canopy is also contributing.
Right. So I go back quite a ways on this topic of green space, in terms of even our evolutionary history as a species. Like, we are a species that really emerged from the forest, and much of our health and much of our well-being is really tied very closely to green spaces, to trees, to canopied forests. And as we think about those forests slowly kind of being more surgically placed into neighborhoods, we're really talking about which neighborhoods were able to receive those trees and which neighborhoods didn't receive those trees. And if you have when you have a policy like redlining and segregation, creating these invested and disinvested spaces, these marginalized spaces, these highly lifted up spaces, we see that the materials that are used for the housing, we see that the available planting space for trees, we see that the green spaces for parks and natural areas follow suit with that investment spectrum. And as a result, the areas that have very little planting space because there's a freeway in that place, or a big box store with large parking lots, trees and green spaces and parks are squeezed out. And where do those large asphalt-hungry developments not go? Often in the neighborhoods that have the large kind of median strips, those areas between the sidewalk and the road, they tend to be larger in wealthier neighborhoods where you can plant large form trees, get lots of shade. And as a result, we see the health and well-being of communities in those areas with larger amounts of green space, whether in the form of trees in the yard, whether in the public spaces in front of their homes, or in larger amounts of parks in and around the neighborhood. We see the health measures of communities living in areas with more green space consistently better than in places where there's a lot less green space. And that not only translates on a day-to-day kind of chronic experience of exposure to heat and other environmental pollutants and what we call in the field environmental insults, where you're getting exposed to larger amounts of lead, particulate matter, nitrogen oxides, and many other air pollutants in combination with that heat, because you're right adjacent to a freeway. We're seeing that also play out intergenerationally through research happening in fields like epigenetics. So we're really starting to unpack this very long-standing pattern of health-related impacts that emerge from these land use planning decisions that have been made decades ago.
Well, we'd love to hear from our viewers. Let us know where you're watching, but also drop a comment and join this conversation. Are you in a city that has these redlining, these historic redlining policies in these areas that are now, as we're hearing, heat islands that are suffering even more from the extreme heat, and those temperatures are even rising further? We'd love for you to join the conversation. Well, Vivek, this has real life implications. It's a life or death situation, because as you said at the top of the show, that heat kills so many people in this country. And Portland, where you're speaking to us from, a couple of years ago, I know, had a very dire situation with extreme heat. We're at the tail end of the summer where so many parts of the country, and indeed so many parts of the world, suffered through extreme heat. So take us through exactly what this means then for these communities, and particularly if, I would assume, and maybe you could clarify, these are also communities that have older infrastructure. So maybe there are buildings without air conditioning. Talk a little bit about what exactly this means for the people living in these communities.
Right. It's a very rich question, in part because what we're seeing in the climate record very recently is exactly what many of the climate models have been suggesting for decades. We're seeing more frequent heat waves, we're seeing more intense heat waves, and we're seeing longer duration heat waves. The heat wave you mentioned in the Pacific Northwest that claimed almost 1,000 people, very conservative estimate, claimed almost 1,000 lives in 2021, happened at the tail end of June, so at the beginning of summer in the Northern Hemisphere. And that was orders of magnitude greater than anything the Pacific Northwest had ever seen in recorded history. In fact, the climatologist that I spoke to attributed it to a 1 in 1,000 year event that occurred. And as a result, we saw the intense impact not only on human lives, we also saw it on ecosystems, shellfish. We saw trees dying as a result, and we saw a lot of infrastructure buckling and actually failing as a result. We don't have the kinds of infrastructure built in our cities to be able to manage the kind of extreme climate-related events that are falling literally from the clouds or from the sun. And what we're seeing is that the amount of water that's falling from the clouds, often called either atmospheric rivers or what we used to call pineapple expresses, these intense amounts of water that fall, like we're seeing in parts of South Asia right now, where the water that used to fall 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago is very different than the amount of water and the pipe systems underground that can pull that water off the streets or even move it or infiltrate it. They don't exist anymore. We've either paved over a lot of those areas where the water can infiltrate, or we've created a pipe system that are based on 50 or 100 year ago amounts of water that fall. And so what will happen is you get backup of those pipes, you have less infiltration of that water, and you see rapid flooding and very extensive flooding, which then has very long-term impacts on the infrastructure. The way I tend to look at the relationship between flooding and heat is simply that flooding often doesn't claim as many lives. It creates really large impacts on infrastructure. So that's homes and basements and and office spaces and hospitals and critical infrastructure like that. It isolates communities. Flooding often blocks roads, and so communities can't sometimes get access to grocery stores and basic services. So it's a pretty acute effect when we're talking about flooding and its relationship to the infrastructure that we've inherited and locked in over the decades. And with heat, what we're seeing is kind of lives and public health being impacted. Infrastructure to a certain extent as well. What we're seeing are a lot of buildings that have been put up in especially northern latitudes where no air conditioning has been installed, or more, I think, insidiously, many of the windows, even on the upper floors of apartment buildings, aren't operable. So we have a community, we have a resident living in a third, fourth, or even higher floor apartment where we know as heat rises, those upper floor apartments get extremely hot to the point where if you have a pre-existing health condition, or if you're older or in some way compromised, in terms of your health, you'll have a very high likelihood of perishing during those heat waves if your windows aren't operable and the temperatures are going upwards of 120, 130 degrees Fahrenheit in your residence. And that is something that we're starting to see more often. And planners and even architects haven't been at this stage designing the kinds of developments that we need to be more heat sensitive and more heat responsive, and simultaneously more flood responsive as well. So we're really looking at a pretty mind-boggling amount of infrastructure transformation that has to happen relatively quickly over a vast amount of space. And so the Herculean level of effort required on this is just really humbling, because we are at a stage where we're seeing the intensity, frequency, and duration of climate-related events accelerate, and at the same time, our infrastructure, the thing that protects us often from some of these acute impacts, is not responding in the way that it was, in the way that we'd like it to respond.
It seems then that this infrastructure, or access to certain infrastructure, like air conditioning, will be one of the new lines that's being drawn, that we're seeing these sharp inequalities, and particularly in those communities that have already suffered through generations of poverty. Getting back to that study that you co-authored that showed this multi-generational impact of poverty. Now people living in these formerly redlined areas are in these heat zones. Those communities don't have access to this infrastructure as well. So we're seeing even further inequality as a result of all of this.
Right. Air conditioning is kind of our real quick response to heat. We've done it in many parts of the South. Most buildings have air conditioning in them. Although schools, unfortunately, as schools are opening right now and over the next period here, we're seeing a lot of schools. Temperatures are still 100, 110 Fahrenheit, and many of the children are not having air conditioning. That, let alone residences where communities, when they're trying to figure out, even if they can afford an AC, and even if a local policy, such as the one recently passed in Oregon, where it's a right to cooling bill that requires landlords of rental properties to allow for the installation of air conditioning. Even then, the question becomes, how can that person who's trying to manage multiple bills pay for a $200, $300, $400 electricity bill at the end of the month when they're running their air conditioning, which is a very energy hungry appliance? And so part of this challenge is, how do we couple the cooling systems that we know work with not only sources cooling systems that are improved in efficiency, and also with energy assistance programs that can support communities that might not be able to run the AC and stay cool, with renewable sources of energy that reduce the likelihood of greater amounts of greenhouse gases being emitted as more and more air conditioning units find their way into the northern latitudes. So we really have a multi-pronged solution that we need to be thinking of. While air conditioning is one, we need to couple that with energy assistance and with sources of energy that actually don't warm up the planet further.
And it seems we need to engage all parties, the health department. This is a public health issue, not just physical health, but mental health. There was a recent New York Times article that showed a direct link between poor mental health outcomes, indeed even an increase in suicide and extreme heat as well as engaging the planners, the urban planners, the architects, the engineers, and the energy folk as well. So to that end, Vivek, you said it's a bit of a Herculean task, but what is being done? Is there anything being done that either viewers could get behind and pay attention to, and urge folk to support, people in power to support? Or what do you see as even the first step in this giant task?
Sure. Yeah, I really tend to take enormous, kind of what we call grand challenges like climate change, and try to start thinking about it in short, medium, and longer term approaches. And from a very short term approach, these acute and extreme events are increasing in frequency, as we discussed. And the need to get communities into safe spaces is really like the first step. This would require public health, emergency management, and any social support organizations that are in and around and in a city, a community, a rural environment. Like, how do we find adequate cooling resources? Meaning, if it's a cooling shelter, or if it's recently an uptick in resilience hubs, places where there's always heating or cooling available, there's food, you can stay overnight in these locations, it's safe, it's accessible, it's community oriented. Communities, regardless of citizenship, etc., can use these spaces. It's really one of those short-term solutions that we need to get folks out of harm's way. Like, so there's a whole number of solutions there. There's a medium-term solution where we're really starting to talk about the ways in which we can start offering and creating a social infrastructure for communities to rely on. So that is, whether you're as simple as getting to know your neighbors during an extreme event, whether it's knowing where to go during an extreme event, like having those kinds of options available to you in the medium term, and starting to build that, what we call social capital in your neighborhood, and getting to know each other. We know that just by itself, by knowing and connecting with people around you, reduces the likelihood of being impacted by these extreme events. So that's kind of a medium-term piece that we could really think about. And in the longer-term piece, we really need to be talking about the fundamental shifts that need to be happening in our housing, in our road infrastructure, in our electricity grid, and in the way that we can rely on the ecosystems, like the trees and the green spaces and the wetlands, to be able to safeguard us from some of these extreme events. We fundamentally need to be kind of aligning with the way that the earth and natural systems are shifting right now. And if we try to fight some of those shifts, we're going to be really up against a wall with trying to do that. So we need to create policies that really get at housing that addresses heat, housing that addresses flooding, and kind of predicting and planning for the 50 to 100-year time horizon with the longer term solutions.
And this seems to, these conversations need to happen certainly at an international level as well. I mean, look at what's happening in Pakistan, look at what's happening in all of these vulnerable island, often nations who are just dealing with the absolute devastation of the climate crisis. But here locally, people can engage, I know, on a very local level. Housing policy is often happening at a level that you can have your voice heard, because you can show up to some of these planning meetings and you can actually really have an impact. And I think that's really worth emphasizing. When people feel very overwhelmed by the climate crisis, I think often people feel there's nothing I can do at an individual level, but you can advocate for very local policy that can really have an impact.
Yeah, I agree. I probably serve on more volunteer commissions than I care to admit publicly, but I am on a lot of them. And having one foot into that conversation about how resources are spent on a bond measure that's spending almost $500 million on purchasing of green spaces and kind of natural areas. And I'm trying to figure out, how do we get this committee to think about environments where historic disinvestment has occurred, because that has not been the kind of trajectory of such work. So each of our voices, each of our kind of place, our place locally can really drive change. And so I have my own agendas of what I'd like to see done in terms of further investment and engagements of communities that have been left out of these conversations. And I also would love to figure out a way to get communities who have been marginalized to participate in these conversations as well. Because often what I'm confronted with is no decision about us and without us, right? And so that's a phrase that I've taken really to heart, because it's about how do we engage communities who have been facing some of the first and worst impacts from climate change to participate in those decision-making conversations, and how do we support and empower those communities to actively engage, and what can we do in our own role to enable that to happen. And so that's kind of where I would want to go at that local level of not only individuals, as a privileged person as I am with a full-time job and able to run an air conditioner. I would love to also have communities who are experiencing these in their lives every day to be part of those conversations. And let's create systems that allow that to happen.
Professor Vivek Shandas, thank you very much for being our guest today on Just Solutions.
My pleasure. Thanks for the conversation.
And join us same time, same place next week for another conversation from Free Speech TV's just solutions.